Sean Lemass famously said that much productivity in Ireland was lost by good timekeeping, so I want to welcome the people who just described he was quite right. I'm not an educationalist by any means. I think over the course of the next few minutes, the only thing I'll demonstrate is that I'm a dilettante. So I'm not really going to talk about education. It's a specialism. I wouldn't dream of encroaching on your highly specialised and important turf. And I also think it's a subject that kind of a lot of energy gets expanded on in Ireland. You know, I'm thinking of all of those reports, the piano report, the deaf ears report, there's a whole plethora of them. They must take up as much space as the e-voting machines somewhere. Instead, what I'd like to do is, I'm not going to spoof about music education, I'm going to spoof about some other things that I feel a little bit more comfortable with. And I want to talk about my own experiences actually in music, my own formative experiences in music, which are largely actually autodidactic ones. And some perspectives from my years in concert promotion primarily, some observations about that, and then some pretty wild conjecture on where it all might be headed in terms of the more general music ecology and where we all fit within that, and then some thoughts on maybe a collective response and where this fine new organisation might fit into that. It used to take great scholarship, of course, to be able to have some pithy quotes. So now all you got to do is Google it. So I'll get the quotes out of the way now. Here's a very erudite and edifying one from C.S. Lewis. The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. But I thought you guys would much prefer this one from a guy called Robert Hutchins, who said that there are three major administration problems on a campus. They are sex for the students, athletics for the alumni, and parking for the faculty. And then anytime I address a group of people, I always quote this great Frank Zappa quote where he said, "The music business is a cruel and shallow plastic money trench where thieves run free and good men die. And there's also a negative side." So he really knew what he was talking about. And then my personal favourite, which then for some years I did a residency with a salsa band in a venue called the Rock Garden in Dublin. It was really subterranean and pretty horrible, and the whole dressing room was covered in graffiti, and there was one brilliant piece that said, "Too cool for school, too stupid for the real world. Let's form a band." So I formed a band. My musical, you know, like many of us, I came from a very musically indifferent household. I think typical, you know, funny I mentioned Lemass, I would typify my parents as Lemass people, you know, who not particularly engaged in music. You know, my father had a couple of LPs, a couple of, you know, fairly generic classical things. My mother was a fan of Frank Ifield and stuff like that. And that was about it. No particular attachment to traditional music, even though, I mean, my mother came from County Meath, my father came from not far from here, from West Limerick, but no great attachment around traditional music, which is a thing that always I found a little bit surprising. I remember I got the money together to buy a drum kit when I was about 16 or 17, but they very wisely vetoed it. So my kind of own musical engagement actually came, would you believe, on my 21st birthday. I was living in London, and I bought a tenor saxophone out of the Buy and Sell magazine, and I got it home and I wrestled with it for days, and I thought, well, I'm never going to get on top of this thing at all. But you know, I enrolled in a couple of workshops and things in Islington, funny enough. And I'd already cultivated an interest in jazz, and I started playing a little bit. And then I came back to Ireland, and pretty much at the time, if you had an interest in jazz music, the only outlet was New Park Music Centre in Blackrock, where they were running a little workshop every Wednesday evening, a couple of hours. Little did I know it, but it was kind of the great and the good of the Irish jazz scene. Musicians like Tommy Halford was teaching there, and the Guilfoyle brothers, Ronan and Connor, and that was a kind of, you know, key moment for me, and a key formative experience, and a key kind of connection with a great teacher, with great teachers. That key moment, I think, when you kind of, you meet one of those great mentors who stays with you for a long time in your life, and they become a very formative influence. And that was largely Ronan and Connor Guilfoyle. Around the same time, I started playing in Latin bands with Connor, and looking back on it now, he was so patient with a bunch of young musicians who, to be honest, weren't really at the same level as he was, introducing them to all of these fairly esoteric rhythmic concepts like clave and Afro-Cuban 6/8 rhythms, and teaching us to play this stuff. It was a great time. Around the same period, I started to get, you know, a goo on me for some real serious study as a saxophonist. So I went over to the Royal Conservatory in The Hague, which was at the time and still is one of the finest schools in Holland, and I auditioned for a place there, and I was accepted. I came back to Ireland, and I started to look at what sort of funding opportunities might be available to a guy like me to support some further education in Holland, and they were extremely limited, to say the least, and pretty much the only thing that I could identify was a bursary for advanced instrumentalists, whatever that might mean, that the Arts Council offered. So I duly applied, and of course I wasn't accepted because I didn't really fit with the then criteria as it was shaped, because there wasn't really, I guess they hadn't kind of anticipated, you know, the kind of musician that maybe I represented, as opposed to somebody that was coming out of a more orthodox classical pedagogy. And it was the first time I kind of had that feeling of, and I wouldn't call it prejudice, but I would call it a kind of indifference, you know, a sort of institutional kind of indifference that was to all of the other paths through which we might express ourselves musically. And that was a key moment for me, because I found that quite politicizing, actually. I thought, well, if the system can't engage with somebody like me, then maybe there's a lot of other people who are dropping through the net as well. And I found that a very important moment. Around the same period, I was invited to New York to participate in a week-long workshop at the New School. And that was my first time to encounter, by this stage I was in my mid to late 20s, and I was kind of, you know, kids half my age who were just savages and terrifying, and just playing the living daylights out of the saxophone, and the penny started to drop that whatever about my kind of personal relationship with the instrument, the sort of longer term career aspirations were going to become increasingly problematic, because I had come to the instrument very late. At the same time, David Liebman, who I don't know if any of you are aware of him, who is a great soprano saxophonist who worked with Miles Davis for many years, but is also a sort of kind of galvanic educator, a really powerful personality in jazz education, had come to Dublin, and he had addressed a body about the size of this one, all aspirant musicians, and he said, you know, of course we were all players, and he said at the time, most of you won't be players. And this was a bombshell, you know, of course we were going to be players, we were going to, conquer the world, you know. And I didn't realise until much longer how prophetic those words were, and how much I reflected on it much later on, because I realised that it was a source of great comfort actually later on, because what I realised was that I wanted to be in music, and of music, and about music, and around music, and I had this sort of myopic view that the only way you did that was to play music and be a performer. And it took a while to realise that it could be all of these other things that I have found personally equally fulfilling. Around the same time, I started to get involved with the Improvised Music Company, which is a company of which I'm now the director. And at the time, it was real cottage industry. It was like a couple of people, 3 people, huddled around mugs of tea, you know, writing Arts Council applications. I think the first time we applied to the Arts Council for support, I think they lent us money, actually. I think they lent us £700 or something. And we're now a significant client of the Arts Council. Last year, we were in receipt of €250,000 in funding. So we've come a long road there. But it started out with the things people normally do, picking up people at the airport, you know, looking after the dressing room, getting drinks for musicians at the intermission, all of those things. Around the mid-90s, we started kind of diversifying into world music. I confess I still don't know what that means. I'm much more, I rarely call it that, it makes my skin crawl. I'm sure many of you feel the same way. I say other people's folk music, actually. It seems to be a fairer kind of rubric under which to put all of that music, because to me it seems to be closer to something around folk music. And of course, as you're all well aware, world music is a sort of construct that was dreamt up by people working within the marketing of small independent record labels in London in the late 80s, who needed to figure out a way to find somewhere to rack this stuff in the record shop. So in that respect, it was quite effective. But in every other regard, it's a sort of very kind of, you know, when you consider that it covers vast amounts of the planet's music making, all of Asia, all of Africa, all of Latin America, all of the Balkans and Eastern Europe, it seems like a pretty reductivist term to describe something that is so vibrant and creative. And in any event, the term only has any traction actually pretty much in Europe and in the US. There is no concept of world music in Africa. You know, don't call it that. It's just music. Anyway, one of the first things I did was a group called Rizwan Muazzam Qawwali Group. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the late great Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. He was this fantastic Pakistani artist, and these young guys were his nephews actually, and the music is Sufi devotional music from Pakistan. The Sufis, of course, are a very interesting devotional sect within Islam, very celebratory, very sensuous. Music and poetry is really at the heart of all of their practice and their life, and the music is exquisite. And I wanted to put this show on in a sort of big auditorium. I wanted to make an impression with it, so we put it on in the National Concert Hall, and people kind of said we were kind of mad that we never wouldn't get anyone, and we were terrified at the prospect of putting the show on in the hall actually. So we worked, I mean, super hard. You know, we made a lot of contact with the Pakistani community to kind of get them out, and you know, we kind of did everything we could, and in the end we actually had a very good night with the show. We had about 800 people there. But by far the most important one was one Pakistani gentleman who'd been living in Dublin for some years, arrived into the foyer of the hall and came to, you know, one of us at the hospitality table and said, "Can you tell me where the Qawwali concert is on?" And we said, yeah, it's on in the main auditorium, and he was kind of dumbfounded because he thought it was kind of going to be up in some little 150-seater room. He couldn't, it kind of left a huge impression on this guy that all of these people, and I would say 60 or 70% of the audience was you know, non-Asian. It was very much a Dublin audience, had come out to hear what he perceived his music. And that was a formative moment for me because it made me realize that there were all of these other kind of social aspects to the work of kind of putting on the music. And funny enough, there was a gentleman here recently, an Irish guy called Mark O'Neill, who's he's now the director of the Kelvin Grove Museum in Glasgow, and he's from Belfast, I think, and he's really inspirational. He came over to talk about multiculturalism within the National Cultural Institutions because there's some new policy. The Arts Council has issued some new policy in that area. But he kind of set out the Kelvin Grove stall about its approach to these things, and I'm going to tell them to you now because I think it's really, I found it inspirational, and I think within our work in terms of the social context of music, particularly if it engages with the other, whatever the other might be, this is really important. He said that the work had to embrace human interest. You had to locate it in a wider context. You had to face up to the difficult meanings. You had to acknowledge the non-rational and the spiritual. You had to represent the cultures from within as well as without, and that you had to assume that reason, beauty, and subjectivity are human universals shaped by cultures. I mean, I found that really quite effective. So that was Rizwan Muazzam. And concurrent to this, of course, we were presenting jazz artists. By this stage, we were doing the ESB Dublin Jazz Festival, where we were getting lots of money. Oh, lots of money. It seems like such a long time ago now. And we were developing other things. We were running a weekly jazz night called Pendulum that we've just concluded actually after 15 years, which is a bit poignant for us. The last 8 or 9 of those, we were doing them every Sunday night with JJ Smith's in Angel Street in Dublin. We were touring artists. We were starting to take on work for other clients like the OPW and the Houses of the Oireachtas, and developing a really interesting portfolio. And we were also representing some Irish artists. Concurrent to this, by the way, I got a really lucky break, which is that John Kelly was still doing the Mystery Train on Radio 1, and every August he'd take a month's holidays, and his producer was kind of they try people out, you know, and I got a call to do a week on the Mystery Train, and that was a fantastic opportunity, and pretty much on the back of that I've been involved with Lyric